What's up everybody, Hectico here, and man am I excited. Rumor has it that Final Fantasy X and X-2 are getting released in HD very soon for the PlayStation 3. Now I've had these games pre-ordered for months, even though I don't have a PlayStation 3, but that doesn't matter because Final Fantasy is amazing. So I figured, let's celebrate in the only way that I know how, by making a video. So without further ado, Top 10 Final Fantasy games. To start off this list, I couldn't think of a more fitting game than the one that not only started the Final Fantasy series, but the one that started the JRPG craze in the Americas. Final Fantasy is an aptly named RPG that was published in 1987 as a last resort by creator Hironobu Sakaguchi to live out his dream of making a game. It was a huge success here in America, and it's easy to see why. It had great music, interesting yet fluent tactical elements, and a pretty decent storyline for the time. What really captures my attention in this game is how immersive it can be even though it's such an old game. The medieval-like atmosphere and creative selection of enemies always leaves me hungering for more. Good thing this was just the beginning. Most of you may not know of this little gem, and although it's not technically a Final Fantasy game like the others on this list, it still bears the name and therefore counts. If I have to associate that crappy ass Spirits Within movie with Final Fantasy, then I can count spin-offs. The at-rhythm Final Fantasy is different than other Final Fantasy games, and if that isn't an understatement, I don't know what is. For starters, it's a rhythm game, much like Dance Dance Revolution, just with way less work, effort, and sweat. Now I know it's odd to include a rhythm game in a list primarily composed of JRPGs, but to be honest, it's on this list purely because it's a rhythm game. Final Fantasy games have some of the greatest soundtracks of all time, and I know I've said that throughout quite a few of my other videos. What better way to unwind after a long day than to sit around and listen to some of your favorite Final Fantasy music? The reason this game is so low on the list is because it doesn't offer much in terms of variety. There are 3 different rhythm modes to play, and each Final Fantasy gets 1 song per rhythm mode. That's a maximum of 3 songs a game. Now I know you couldn't possibly fit all the songs on the 3DS cartridge, but that limitation knocked it down a few spots. I know that this game is pretty hated in the Final Fantasy community, but to be honest, I could never bring myself to hate it. Final Fantasy XIII, this game is interesting to say the least. It was the first Final Fantasy released in ages to take a completely different approach to how Final Fantasy was played. A new battle system was introduced, a new era was used as they strayed away from the typical medieval sword and magic deal, and the story was a lot darker than most Final Fantasy games. Now like I said earlier, this game is hated, and I can kinda understand why. The music was lackluster, I didn't really care for any of the characters, and the game was too linear. However, it's not a bad game. It had a lot of elements that were useful, much like the stagger method, the ability to switch roles in the middle of battle, and a very interesting leveling system using the Crystarium, which really reminds me of the Sphere Grid from Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X-2 is another game that wasn't received too well by the fans, but I give it props for originality and for being the first direct sequel to a Final Fantasy game at the time of its release. Now as I said earlier, I give it props for originality, and it deserves them. A lot was different this time around. We had an all-female cast in terms of playable characters, and this is the first game in the series that allows you to switch roles in the middle of battle via dress spheres. Although this game's story, replayability, and musical score is weak compared to its predecessors, I still enjoy it for no other reason than being able to explore Spira some more. Final Fantasy XIII-2. There's a lot to say about this game in terms of a sequel. I imagine the concept went like this.
I've got it. The next big idea.
What is it?
We make a sequel to Final Fantasy XIII.
But everybody hated that game. They complained it was too linear.
Yeah, but we change it up and we put a little bit of time travel and we confuse the hell out of it.
Genius. Now obviously it didn't go just like that. I'm sure there were way more people in the room. But Final Fantasy XIII-2 was just that, a drastic change. The main complaint about Final Fantasy XIII was that it was too linear. This game did the exact opposite, but not in a good way. Most of the time I had no idea where the hell I was supposed to go or what I was supposed to do. With that said, it still secures a pretty decent spot on the list because I like the story and the musical score was phenomenal. Final Fantasy IX. Surprisingly, I hated this game when it was first released. As a kid, I could never get behind it. It didn't resonate with me. However, I'm an adult now, so naturally my opinions have changed. I actually love this game now. I'm a huge fan of the 4-person party, which is a throwback to the original Final Fantasy games. Now I can't comment much on the story because I never finished the game. I only beat the first 3 discs, and I never started the 4th. I couldn't find the damn thing. But from what I played, I thought it was pretty good. Not the best, but pretty solid. What I really liked were the characters, except Kina. Whatever the hell that thing is. I was genuinely interested in the love between Zidane and Garnet, and Steiner's struggle. Aside from that, this game had a spectacular soundtrack with songs like the battle theme, Feel My Blade, The Place I'll Return to Someday, Vamos a la Flamenco, and many others. Please don't shoot me. I know the general consensus is something along the lines of Zamg! Best FF game, why you put so low? And I get that it's the most successful Final Fantasy game here in America, but Final Fantasy VII never did much for me. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic game, blessed with great music, immersive environments, tons of side quests, and great characters. However, the one thing Final Fantasy usually excels at seemed absent from this game: the story. Now there's a pretty solid story, it's just not good enough for me to put this higher up on the list. With that said, it is a fantastic game in which I can easily pour over 100 hours into, but it's not taking the cake today. Final Fantasy IV, or 2 depending on how you grew up, is an instant classic and a huge favorite of mine. When I think of a great JRPG, this is the first game that comes to mind. It's a fun game with interesting characters, a few plot twists, and some sad moments. This is the game that started my Final Fantasy craze and obsession with Nobuo Uematsu's musical work. Plus, Cecil is such a badass. This is the epitome of a beautiful game. Final Fantasy X is a masterpiece. I really can't think of any games, Final Fantasy or not, that touch me like this game has. The music is beautifully composed, which comes as no surprise considering this is the first Final Fantasy that was not composed solely by Nobuo Uematsu. The environment is vast, to say the least. There's so much to explore, the locations change and demonstrate an otherworldly beauty that hasn't quite been captured before or ever since. The story is phenomenal, it's deep, immersive, and it hits you with a few left turns. It never gets boring. This game was groundbreaking due to its visuals, the Aeon summoning battle mechanics, and the introduction of a new leveling system using the sphere grid. This game is as close to flawless as you can get. Final Fantasy X is a beautiful game in every aspect, and it should be no surprise that it managed to secure such a high spot on my list. Now I'm guessing a lot of you expected this, seeing as how the game's case, the gunblade, and the game's characters are all on my set when I film a video. But either way, I have to talk about what an amazing game this is. Final Fantasy VIII is not only my favorite Final Fantasy, but it's my favorite game of all time. Growing up, I didn't understand it much. It was a bit harder to follow than the other Final Fantasies due to the complex lead character Squall, a fast-paced, double-sided story, and a difficult yet rewarding junction system that took the place of leveling up. However, I felt a certain affinity for it even back then. So naturally, it was no surprise when I picked it up 10 years later that I instantly fell in love with the game. The mechanics, the characters, the music, and the environment all captured me in ways I thought impossible. It's like I was living inside of the game. I obsessed over it and desired nothing more than to play it until there was nothing left to do in the game, and I still feel that way now. Although Final Fantasy VIII definitely has its weak points and isn't as strong of a game as Final Fantasy X is, it holds a special place in my heart that prevents it from ever being in second place.